pinned beneath the wild Mustang, blood seeping into his eyes. Logan Carter knew if he didn't act this very second, he might never rise again. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. He lay sprawled in a shallow gully, the jagged edges of exposed rock gouging into his back. The Mustang's sharp, panicked snorts rattled his skull, and he felt every thunderous beat of the horse's hooves reverberate through the ground. The wind whipped dust and broken sagebrush around them, the swirling grit stinging Logan's open cuts. With his arms pinned awkwardly, he struggled to breathe. The Mustang's muscled flank twitched above him, tension coiling like a spring. One misstep, one wrong movement, and the Mustang would crush his ribs without hesitation. Logan grimaced, remembering that just a few moments ago, he had been confident, too confident, thinking he could rope and subdue this remarkable creature all by himself. Now the reek of sweat and fear from both man and horse mingled in the cold, high-altitude air. A trickle of blood ran down his left temple, blending with the dust to form a red smear across his cheek. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. His entire body screamed with pain, but adrenaline forced him to focus. He told himself to push, or roll, or do something, because if he didn't, the Mustang's next lunge would be his last. He inhaled the thin mountain air, wincing at the pain in his ribs, and tried to slide his arm free from beneath his body. The Mustang, in a frenzy of confusion and rage, snorted and shifted its weight, pressing down on Logan's legs. Logan groaned. He couldn't tell if the snapping sensation he felt was a branch beneath him, or one of his own bones. For a split second, he considered letting go of everything, his pride, his determination, just to survive. But survival had never been simple for him. He'd grown up wrestling colts and filling feed buckets on a failing ranch, always teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Every horse he broke, every wild creature he tamed, brought in just enough money to keep the lights on for a few more months. Now, this majestic black Mustang was supposed to be his salvation, a high-risk gamble that, if broken correctly and trained well, could fetch a price that might cover his past-due mortgage. The Mustang reared, threatening to bring its powerful hooves down on Logan's chest. In a surge of desperation, Logan twisted onto his side, yanking his leg free at the last second. Rocks cut into his skin, but he found just enough leverage to scramble backward, crawling across the dirt like a wounded animal. The Mustang spun around, tail lashing, eyes wide with fury. Logan's hat lay crumpled to the side, half buried under the displaced gravel. His rope, the one he had so carefully coiled and thrown, lay slack across a nearby boulder, an embarrassing testament to how badly this attempt had gone. Logan dragged himself a few more feet away, breathing in shallow, pained gulps. The Mustang stood snorting, ears pinned back against its skull, as though assessing whether Logan was still a threat. For a moment, neither moved, and an uneasy truce took shape in that rocky gully. Logan's chest heaved, his body and mind screaming that he should run while he still could. But he also knew he was miles away from his base camp. Dusk was already creeping in, the sky turning a watercolor of purples and oranges above the jagged mountain line. If he let the Mustang go now, he'd be stranded in the wilderness with no horse, no radio, and multiple injuries that needed attention. And if he couldn't make it back to camp, there would be no help waiting. He tried to stand, but a searing pain in his side dropped him to one knee. He pressed a hand to his ribs, feeling for any swelling or cracks, but the pain was too overwhelming to pinpoint exactly what was wrong. He tasted copper in his mouth. He'd bitten his tongue or maybe his cheek when he fell. The metallic tang mixed with the bitter flavor of dust. Drawing a ragged breath, he forced himself upright, swaying, every muscle trembling under the strain. The Mustang watched him with wide, liquid eyes. Logan took a half step toward it, arms outstretched, not in aggression but in a silent appeal. The horse scraped a hoof against the rocky ground, sending loose stones clattering. Logan swallowed hard. He had two choices: try again to capture this beast or attempt the grueling trek back to camp on foot. Neither option offered any guarantee of survival. He squared his shoulders, ignoring the pain, and inched closer. The Mustang stomped, lashing its tail, its body quivering with the readiness to bolt, or to charge. Logan kept his voice calm, though it wavered with exhaustion as he murmured, "Easy now, easy." The wind stole his words, but perhaps the tone alone might quell the animal's agitation. After all, Logan had spent years learning the subtle language of horses, the shift of weight, the tilt of ears, the lowering of the head that signaled trust. However, the Mustang showed none of those signs. It remained coiled and rigid, a living coil of tension and muscle. He took another step forward, but the Mustang reared, forelegs pawing the air in a display that nearly made Logan's heart stop. He staggered back, panting. He couldn't endure another fall like the one that had just happened. And yet, he couldn't force himself to turn away. No matter how battered he was, the ranch's future balanced on a razor's edge. This horse was more than a paycheck. It was a chance to keep his livelihood afloat. Another day, another horse might not come along, not one with the fire and spirit that made it so valuable on the open market. A chill wind brushed over his sweat-soaked back, signaling the swift approach of night. Shadows crawled across the rocky landscape. Logan glanced around. The gully offered no refuge, only more loose gravel and precarious boulders. Beyond the gully, the terrain leveled out into rolling foothills dotted with sparse trees and patches of dry grass. He had no tent, no gear, no source of heat. The Mustang, if it were amenable, could be his ticket out of here, a living, breathing lifeline. But as things stood, he might as well try to tame a twister. He hobbled slowly toward his rope, all the while keeping a wary eye on the Mustang. Each movement sent daggers of pain through his side, and he was certain at least one rib was cracked. The Mustang snorted and tossed its head, but didn't charge. Logan bent to pick up the rope, biting back a moan. He looped it over his shoulder, never breaking eye contact with the Mustang. Blood trickled down his forearm from a shallow cut, and he realized for the first time just how many abrasions he had. His palms were raw, torn open from the frantic scramble against the rocks. He tried to recall how he'd ended up in the gully in the first place. The plan had been simple: watch the horse from a distance, approach quietly, and rope it when it was calm. But the Mustang had spooked, bolting like a shadow across the rugged slope, and Logan chased after it without thinking. One misstep on the loose stones, and gravity did the rest. The Mustang had been cornered, and cornered animals fight. Now here they were, both battered, both breathing hard. Logan needed a new plan, one that wouldn't get them both killed. He moved closer again, this time more carefully. He kept his posture low, non-threatening. Horses read body language better than people do. He tried to project an aura of calm determination, even though his heart still hammered from the adrenaline. The Mustang snorted, skittish, shifting its weight from side to side, clearly torn between fleeing and standing its ground. A single trembling moment passed. Then, without warning, the Mustang bolted, hooves kicking up gravel as it surged out of the gully and into the open foothills. Logan shouted hoarsely and hurried after it, stumbling on the uneven ground. He cursed himself for not anticipating the horse's flight. He could scarcely afford to chase it in his condition, but he had no other choice. Every step was agony. His ankle, bruised from the earlier fall, threatened to buckle beneath him. His lungs burned from the thin air and the strain of pushing through the pain. Still, he pressed on. The Mustang was only a dark blur against the gathering twilight. It didn't go far, though. Instead of disappearing into the horizon as Logan feared, the horse slowed, prancing in a wide arc around him. It kept just enough distance to stay safe, and Logan suspected it was as exhausted as he was. He paused to catch his breath. The world seemed to spin, the sky swirling with a kaleidoscope of dimming colors. He felt lightheaded, on the verge of collapse, but he had to stay upright. He focused on the horse's silhouette, every sense trained on the Mustang. Lightning flickered to the west, illuminating distant storm clouds rolling in over the mountains. The flash revealed the horse in stark contrast, its mane whipping in the wind. Thunder growled a moment later, an ominous promise. Logan knew he had to find shelter soon. A storm in these parts could turn lethal in an instant, dropping the temperature drastically and unleashing torrential rains that could trigger flash floods. The last thing he wanted was to be caught in a raging storm with no cover, and open wounds. He glanced around in the dim light, searching for any place that might serve as a makeshift camp. The foothills offered scant protection, mostly scrub brush, brittle grass, and the occasional twisted pine. The Mustang continued circling, closer now, watching him with eyes that reflected the faint glow of the storm's approach. Logan realized something. The horse wasn't simply running away. It was curious, almost drawn to him in some strange dance of man and beast. Maybe it sensed his vulnerability, or maybe it was too stubborn to retreat. Either way, Logan whispered to the darkness, "Come on, boy, let's find some place to ride out the night." He took a step, and the Mustang reared back, but didn't flee. Slowly, painfully, Logan resumed his pursuit, keeping his rope coiled but ready. He tried not to appear threatening, no sudden moves, no loud shouts. The Mustang trotted ahead, leading him toward a cluster of rocks that jutted out from the hillside. The wind picked up, howling through the ravines, carrying the scent of wet earth and electricity. The storm was coming fast. Logan paused at the first large boulder, pressing his back against it to catch his breath. His entire body felt as though it had been run through a wringer. A flash of lightning lit the sky, and he caught a glimpse of the Mustang watching him from just a few yards away, ears perked, tail flicking anxiously. The temperature dropped, and fat droplets of rain began to patter on the stony ground. In minutes, those droplets would turn into a downpour. Gritting his teeth, Logan hoisted himself upright. He had to act now, while he could still move. If he got soaked and the wind turned colder, hypothermia was a real threat. He scanned the area for a shallow cave or some overhang that could serve as shelter. Nature had carved a few recesses in these hills, and if he was lucky, he'd stumble on one before the worst of the storm hit. Then he saw it. Just beyond the next rise, the land curved inward, creating a small, natural alcove. He limped toward it, beckoning silently to the Mustang, though he couldn't imagine why the horse would follow him. Still, part of him hoped. The sky unleashed a cold torrent of rain, drenching him instantly. The water stung his cuts, mingling with the blood that trickled from his injuries. His boots slipped on the wet ground, and he had to grab at the nearby rocks to keep from falling. The thunderclap overhead was so loud that it felt like the mountain itself was splitting in two. He finally reached the alcove and collapsed beneath it, pressing his back to the rocky wall. The roof wasn't large, but it might keep him from getting completely soaked. Lightning illuminated the Mustang again, and Logan saw it prancing anxiously in the storm. He realized with a pang of guilt that the horse, too, needed shelter. But why would it trust him enough to share this space? He swallowed hard, thinking back to every lesson he'd ever learned about gentling horses. You don't break them with brute force, you show them you're not an enemy. So he called out softly, straining to be heard over the wind and rain. "Come on, fella, it's all right. I won't hurt you." The words seemed small and futile in the face of the raging tempest. Nonetheless, he held out his hand into the rain, palm up, offering no rope, no trap, just an invitation. The Mustang took an uncertain step toward him, ears pricked, water dripping from its mane. Logan felt his heart pound, each beat echoing the roar of thunder. It was a moment suspended in time, man and horse, battered by nature, confronted with a choice. Would the Mustang trust him enough to seek refuge under the same rocky ledge, or would it bolt into the storm? The horse tossed its head, snorted, and then advanced another step. Slowly, hesitantly, the Mustang closed the distance. Logan held his breath. Another bright flash overhead revealed the Mustang's dark coat shining with rain, each muscle tense. Finally, the horse lowered its head just a fraction, stepping beneath the rocky overhang. Logan exhaled, relief mingling with awe. There they were, practically pressed together by the confines of the space and the torrent outside, sharing a precarious peace. The Mustang's body radiated heat, and Logan reached out gently. The horse flinched away at first, but then allowed the briefest touch of Logan's fingers on its shoulder. Logan blinked away tears that weren't just from pain. In that instant, he understood how close he was to death, cold, wounded, and alone in a storm, but also how much he needed this animal. The Mustang had every reason to kill him or leave him to die, but here it stood, trembling, uncertain, but present. The temperature plummeted further as the storm unleashed its fury on the hillside. Hail mixed with rain, clattering against the rocky outcropping. Logan closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, even though every inhale sent a lance of agony through his side. He murmured something, words he couldn't even hear himself, but maybe the tone conveyed a plea or a promise. When he opened his eyes again, the Mustang had settled in, its sides expanding and contracting with each breath. Logan noted a small trickle of blood on the horse's flank. He must have injured it during their fall. Guilt gnawed at him. He was supposed to be a professional horseman, and he'd hurt this magnificent creature. He sighed, letting the drumming of the rain lull him into a kind of trance. Despite the storm raging just a few feet away, the small alcove felt strangely intimate. The Mustang's breathing was steady, a soothing counterpoint to the crashing thunder. Logan considered his next move. If the storm lasted through the night, they'd both be stuck here for hours. He'd have time to tend to his own wounds, though he had little in the way of supplies, just a rag he could tear from his shirt and whatever brand of grit remained in his soul. He might also try to check the Mustang's injury, though that would require a level of trust that might still be too soon to ask for. A lightning bolt struck somewhere on the ridge above, sending an almost instantaneous burst of light and crack of thunder. The Mustang startled, pinning its ears back and stamping nervously. Logan laid a calming hand on its shoulder, wincing as he leaned forward. The horse stiffened but didn't pull away completely. Small steps, he reminded himself. Just small steps toward understanding, or at least toward mutual survival. Because that was all this moment was about, surviving the night, surviving the storm, and hoping that come morning, he'd have the strength to face the many miles back to camp. As the wind screamed overhead, Logan found his mind drifting to the ranch he'd left behind. He pictured the sagging barn, the peeling paint on the porch, and the dusty corral where he'd learned to rope calves as a boy. He thought of the stack of bills that towered on his kitchen table, each warning more dire than the last. That was the reason he was out here, risking his life for one horse. Some might call it foolish, but for Logan, it was simply the last shot he had at saving the place he called home. He hugged himself, shivering, and felt the Mustang shift beside him, as if drawn closer by the storm's chill. A flicker of hope lit in his chest. He wasn't out of the woods, far from it, but for now, he was still breathing, still fighting. The Mustang was with him, neither attacking nor fleeing, and together they shared the slender refuge. The storm raged on, but the night would eventually pass, and at first light, he'd have a chance to either attempt riding the horse or limping back on foot. Time was a cruel master out here. If his wounds got infected, or if the cold set deep in his bones, it wouldn't matter how many Mustangs he caught. He'd never make it out alive. The wind changed direction, spraying them with an icy mist. Logan pulled his jacket tighter around himself, pressing closer to the Mustang, who snorted in annoyance but didn't lash out. He realized with a jolt that the horse's warmth against his side was the only thing keeping his teeth from chattering uncontrollably. Outside, the lightning flashed like a strobe, turning the hills into a flickering panorama of ghostly shapes. He felt each thunderclap like a punch to his ribs, the vibration reverberating inside his battered body. He tried to plan for the morning, tried to think through each step he would need to take, but his thoughts kept slipping into darkness. It took all his willpower to remain awake, to stay vigilant in case the Mustang spooked or the storm changed course. Sleep tugged at him, beckoning him into oblivion. But giving in to that siren call could be deadly. He forced himself to keep his eyes open, focusing on the Mustang's rhythmic breathing. The horse was unbelievably strong, resilient, and it had survived countless nights in the wild. Logan wondered if, deep down, the Mustang recognized that he was hurt, that he posed no real threat. Maybe that was why it stayed close, though he figured he might never know for sure. He whispered to the horse again, talking about nothing, memories of gentle maras he trained, the day he first fell off a pony as a kid. His words spilled out in a hoarse ramble, but it kept him awake. The Mustang flicked its ears, as though listening, but who could say if it understood anything except the soft cadence of a broken man's voice? In the lulls between thunderclaps, Logan could almost believe he was back home, safe under a roof, not crouched against cold rock in the wilderness. Then the reality of the storm would crash over him again, dispelling any illusions. Hours passed. The storm's intensity began to wane, though rain continued to fall in a steady patter. Logan's throat felt raw from thirst, and his stomach clenched with hunger. He reached outside the alcove, gathering some of the rain in his cupped palm, swallowing it down with a grateful gasp. He even let some water trickle over his open wounds, biting back the pain as the cold liquid flushed away dirt and grit. The Mustang took a few cautious steps toward the open, letting the rain hit its muzzle, drinking what it could. Its flanks shuddered when lightning struck again, but by now the storm had moved farther down the valley, the thunder less deafening. Eventually, Logan couldn't fight sleep any longer. He sagged against the rocky wall, eyes drooping, comforted by the Mustang's faint warmth. He knew it was dangerous to let his guard down, but his body demanded rest. Darkness crept over him, a heavy blanket of exhaustion that smothered his senses. Right before he slipped into unconsciousness, he felt something brush against his arm. Perhaps the Mustang's muzzle, a sign of silent kinship or a simple investigation of the human that had collapsed beside it. He smiled faintly, thoughts drifting away. When dawn came, it was with an eerie stillness. Logan opened his eyes, momentarily disoriented. His entire body felt stiff and battered, and for a confusing second, he wondered if he was already dead. Then he smelled the wet earth, felt the chill in the air, and heard the quiet snort of the Mustang. He had survived the night. His side throbbed, and he pressed a hand to it, hissing in pain. But at least he was alive. A pale morning light filtered into the alcove, revealing the landscape outside still soaked and glistening. The storm clouds were now a dark mass on the far horizon. He turned his head to see the Mustang standing just beyond the shelter, nibbling at a patch of damp grass. The horse glanced over when Logan stirred, ears swiveling. Logan sat up, suppressing a groan. His back felt like it had been raked over nails, and the sharp ache in his chest confirmed his worst fear, a broken or at least severely bruised rib. He gingerly rose to his feet, leaning a hand on the rocky ledge for support. The Mustang tensed, ready to spring away if he tried anything. Logan lifted his arms in a sign of peace. He took a step toward the opening, wincing at the strain in his legs. Outside, the air was cold but fresh, and the storm's aftermath glistened on every surface. Patches of cloud lingered in the sky, but the sun's rays began to pierce through. He felt a fleeting sense of renewal, as though nature was giving him a second chance. Then he remembered he was still wounded, still a day's travel from camp, and still needed this horse's help to get out of here alive. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Taking a slow, measured approach, he inched closer to the Mustang, keeping his hands visible. The horse watched him with wary eyes. Logan spoke softly, his voice husky from the night's ordeal. "We made it," he whispered, though the words were more for his own benefit than the horse's. "Now, we gotta get home." He reached out tentatively, and the Mustang snorted. Logan paused, letting the horse catch his scent again. He had to convince the animal that letting him closer was a better idea than running. Time stretched. Finally, the Mustang allowed him near enough to lay a hand on its shoulder. Logan felt the powerful muscles beneath the wet coat. The horse trembled slightly, but didn't move away. Logan exhaled, relief and nervousness mingling in his stomach. This was the moment. He'd either form a bond or shatter whatever fragile connection they had. With cautious, steady movements, he slid his hand along the horse's neck, checking for the injury he'd seen the previous night. There was a small cut, crusted with blood, but it didn't look too deep. The Mustang jerked at the touch but didn't lash out. Logan spoke gentle reassurances, half-murmured nonsense intended to soothe. He glanced around the sodden hills. The route back to camp would involve crossing uneven terrain, perhaps a creek swollen from the storm, and climbing a gentle rise before descending into the valley. On foot, wounded as he was, it would be a Herculean task. With the Mustang, it might just be possible, if the horse allowed him to ride. That was the question. Logan swallowed hard, reminding himself that sometimes necessity forged alliances that seemed impossible under normal circumstances. He gripped the rope, which was still slung over his shoulder, but he hesitated to loop it around the Mustang's neck. Doing so might break the horse's fragile trust. He decided to try a different approach first. He gently stroked the Mustang's mane, then positioned himself alongside the horse, pressing his injured side against its body for stability. He gathered his shaky legs under him, then placed his hands on the horse's back. The Mustang stirred, skittish. Logan whispered soothingly, feeling the tension in the horse's muscles. Another moment of decision. Would it allow him onto its back, or would it fling him off in a heartbeat? He braced himself. With a heave, Logan lifted himself, swinging one leg over the horse's broad back. The Mustang squealed and sidestepped, almost unseating him. Logan clenched his jaw against the flare of pain in his ribs. He forced himself to remain calm, hands splayed across the horse's neck, trying to convey that he meant no harm. The Mustang paced in a small circle, snorting and shaking its head, but it didn't buck him off. Logan's heart hammered so loudly he could hear the rush of blood in his ears. He was riding bareback, with no saddle or bridle, just raw determination and a minimal sense of balance. He took a moment to adjust, leaning forward to ease the strain on his injuries. The Mustang tossed its head but gradually settled into a tentative acceptance of his presence. Logan exhaled shakily. He couldn't believe it was letting him do this. He nudged the horse's flank gently with his heel, and the Mustang moved forward a few steps, uncertain. The pain in Logan's ribs flared with every jolt, but he gritted his teeth. If he could just make it back to the camp, he could get proper medical care and see if he could truly help this horse. They started slowly across the wet, uneven ground. Each stride felt like a hammer blow to Logan's battered body, but he had to keep moving. He guided the Mustang with subtle shifts of weight, hoping his knowledge of horse behavior would fill in where tack was missing. The Mustang's ears flicked back and forth, attuned to everything around them: far-off thunder, the sound of dripping water, the soft murmurs Logan made. They climbed the first rise, slipping a bit on the muddy surface, but together they maintained footing. The world felt surreal under the fresh morning light. The storm clouds loomed in the distance, a reminder of nature's fury, yet the high desert plateau they traversed sparkled with rain-soaked clarity. Logan could see for miles: rolling hills, rocky outcrops, sparse clumps of trees. Somewhere out there, his base camp waited. He looked for familiar landmarks: a peculiar bend in a stunted pine tree, a large boulder shaped like a bear's head. His memory was muddled, but he thought they were heading in the right direction. As they descended into a shallow basin, the Mustang suddenly jerked to the side. Logan nearly fell off, grunting in pain. Ahead, a quick dart of movement revealed the presence of coyotes, drawn by the scent of blood or the hope of scavenging. Typically, coyotes wouldn't pose much danger to an adult man, especially one on horseback, but Logan was injured, and the Mustang was skittish. Fear coursed through him. He grabbed a tighter hold of the horse's mane, trying to keep them steady. The coyotes, 3 or 4 of them, slunk through the brush, their eyes gleaming with cautious hunger. Logan clicked his tongue and urged the Mustang forward at a faster pace. The horse responded with a burst of speed, but the abrupt motion sent agony through Logan's ribs. He gasped, fighting to stay conscious. Dizziness threatened to swamp him. The coyotes bounded after them, yipping and snarling. Logan clenched his teeth, realizing that if they sensed weakness, they might become bold enough to attack. He needed to keep moving, to find safer ground, or at least a defensible position. The Mustang snorted, ears pinned back. It could sense the predator's proximity, and fear radiated through its powerful body. Pushing through the pain, Logan guided the horse toward a rocky outcrop on a slight rise. If he could get them onto higher ground, maybe the coyotes would lose their nerve. The chase was brief but harrowing, the Mustang galloping across the slick, puddle-strewn earth. Mud splashed up under its hooves, spattering Logan's already filthy clothes. He clung on with every ounce of strength, ignoring the screaming protest of his injuries. The wind whipped past his ears, the cold air stinging his eyes. At the outcrop, the horse slowed, sides heaving, steam rising from its wet coat. Logan surveyed the area. The coyotes paced below, eyeing them with predatory cunning. Logan cursed under his breath. He had only his knife. His rope was useless in this situation, and any bullet he might have had was back at camp, with his rifle. The Mustang stomped a hoof, tossing its head. Logan could feel the animals trembling beneath him, a tremor born of adrenaline and panic. If the coyotes decided to rush them, this could get ugly. He recalled a trick from his childhood, watching his father ward off wild dogs with loud shouts and aggressive gestures. If he could scare them enough, they might back off. So he raised his arms and let out a sharp yell, a primal sound that echoed against the stones. The coyotes flinched, but then the largest one snarled, baring its teeth. They weren't deterred. Logan realized they probably smelled the blood from his wounds, recognized the horse's fatigue. This was a gamble for them, a chance at an easy kill. A low, menacing growl drifted up from below. The Mustang shifted, nearly spinning around, but Logan steadied it, desperate to hold the higher ground. If they ran, the coyotes would chase. If they stayed, they had to be ready to fight. Rain still dripped from Logan's hair, tracing icy paths down his neck. He wasn't sure how much more he could endure. But giving up wasn't an option. He inhaled, forcing down the wave of dizziness, and unsheathed his knife. The blade was small, but it was something. The lead coyote lunged suddenly, rushing up the slope with surprising speed. Logan kicked the Mustang's sides and shouted again, hoping the horse would respond. And respond it did. As if recalling its own wild instincts, the Mustang charged forward, hooves flailing. It struck out at the coyote with deadly force. Logan felt the impact reverberate through the horse's body as one hoof connected with the coyote's flank. The predator yelped and tumbled back, scrambling to avoid another blow. Yet the rest of the pack advanced, snarling and snapping at the horse's legs. Logan's heart pounded, and he swiped at a coyote with his knife when it leaped too close. The Mustang let out a furious scream, a sound that rattled Logan to his core. Side by side, man and beast fought off the circling predators. Mud and loose stones made every movement precarious. The Mustang kicked, twisting, straining to keep them away, while Logan struck at any coyote that came within arm's reach. Another coyote sprang forward, teeth bared, aiming for the horse's haunches. Logan slashed wildly, catching it on the muzzle. It yelped and retreated. He risked a glance around. 2 coyotes were circling wide, trying to flank them. "No, you don't," Logan muttered, urging the Mustang in a quick pivot. The horse stumbled, nearly dropping to one knee. Pain shot through Logan's side. He had to stay balanced or risk tumbling off, where he'd be easy prey. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he yelled, slashing the air as the Mustang feinted a kick. The coyotes scattered momentarily, regrouping a few yards away. Their eyes glowed with hunger, but they seemed wary now, having tasted both hoof and blade. Logan took a ragged breath, chest heaving. Blood dripped from a fresh bite on his calf. One of the coyotes must have grazed him in the melee. The sting was sharp, and the knowledge that coyote bites can turn septic gnawed at his thoughts. But he couldn't focus on that now. He had to get them out of here. "Come on, boy," he murmured to the Mustang, leaning forward, ignoring the fire in his ribs. "Let's go." He nudged the horse into a careful trot, and the Mustang responded, picking its way around the outcrop's edge. The coyotes followed, but at a more cautious distance, clearly debating whether the struggle was worth the potential injury. Logan shouted again, brandishing his knife. That seemed to further deter them. One by one, the coyotes slunk away, though he knew they might try again if they thought they had the advantage. When it seemed the pack was finally gone, Logan allowed the Mustang to slow, though his heart still pounded with lingering fear. They followed a narrow path that curved around the hillside, every step a test of balance on the slick ground. The adrenaline that had fueled their fight began to wear off, leaving Logan trembling and even more aware of his injuries. He pressed a hand to his bleeding calf, feeling warm blood seep between his fingers. "Damn it," he muttered, grimacing. He'd have to clean and wrap it soon. Another glance at the horizon told him they still had hours of travel ahead of them. As they meandered down into the next valley, the terrain flattened slightly. Logan spotted a patch of taller grass near a trickling creek, likely swollen from the night's rain. It was a chance to rest, to let the Mustang drink, and to tend to his wound. He guided the horse over to the water's edge, carefully dismounting with a grunt of pain. His feet hit the ground, and his leg nearly buckled. The Mustang stepped away, shaking out its mane, clearly as exhausted as he was. He limped to the water, kneeling to rinse his calf, flinching as the cold flow stung the bite. The water ran cloudy with his blood, but he gritted his teeth and pressed a rag torn from his shirt against the wound to slow the bleeding. He'd need better care eventually, but this would have to do for now. The Mustang drank greedily, snorting and blowing bubbles in the creek. Watching the horse, Logan felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. This wild creature, which he'd intended to break, had effectively saved his life against those coyotes. Without its strength, he wouldn't have lasted another minute. Logan carefully rose, leaning on a rock for support, and approached the Mustang. The horse lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle, but didn't run. In a moment of silent understanding, Logan placed a gentle hand on its withers. "Thank you," he whispered, not caring that the horse wouldn't comprehend the words, only the tone. The Mustang blinked, as if acknowledging him, then returned to drinking. He took the chance to inspect the horse's injuries. A few scratches, some bruises perhaps, but nothing as severe as it could have been. Logan stroked the horse's neck, murmuring softly. He was beginning to sense that the Mustang's wild instincts were tempered by a surprising capacity for loyalty. At least, loyalty forged under pressure. Maybe, just maybe, there was something between them that could be nurtured. But for now, survival came first. The sun climbed higher, drying the land. Logan gulped some water himself, ignoring the earthy taste, just grateful for the hydration. He considered his next move. Camp lay somewhere east, if he was remembering the geography correctly. With daylight on their side, they could travel steadily, provided his body held up. His calf throbbed with each heartbeat, and his ribs felt like they were encased in shards of glass. But he reminded himself that every step, every minute, was a step away from death and a minute closer to rescue. He gently patted the Mustang's shoulder, then hoisted himself back on its broad back with a stifled groan. The horse snorted, sidestepping, but didn't protest too violently. Logan steadied his breathing. The sky was clear now, offering a clean horizon line to navigate by. He oriented himself by the sun, steering the horse eastward. The Mustang responded to his cues with more acceptance than before, perhaps recognizing that they needed each other if they were to get out of these dangerous mountains. They traveled in silence for the better part of the morning, crossing damp meadows, carefully maneuvering around rocky slopes. Occasionally, Logan spotted movement in the distance, likely deer or elk spooked by the storm. At one point, they passed the remains of a lightning-scorched pine, its bark still smoking. It was a stark reminder that the storm could have easily claimed their lives. Onward they went, each mile feeling like a minor miracle given Logan's condition. By midday, Logan's strength began to wane. His skin felt clammy, and his vision wavered at the edges. The leg wound had stopped bleeding, for now, but the persistent ache told him infection was a real possibility. He clung to the Mustang, focusing on the subtle shifts of the animal's gait to keep from passing out. If he fell now, he might not have the energy to remount, and the Mustang could decide it had had enough of this arrangement. He prayed silently for just a bit more endurance. When he spotted a faint trail that looked familiar, his spirits lifted. A wagon path once used by settlers meandered through this region, and if memory served, it connected to the route leading to his base camp. Though overgrown, the track was still discernible in places. Logan guided the Mustang onto it, hopeful that they were close enough to find some vestige of civilization soon, maybe even the simple lean-to he'd set up as a supply depot. Another wave of pain rolled through him, and he nearly blacked out. The Mustang paused, as if sensing his distress, and turned its head to look at him. Logan forced himself to speak, to remain lucid. "Easy, boy," he rasped. We're almost there." The horse flicked its ears, trotting forward again. After what felt like an eternity of jolting movement, A small wooden structure appeared in the distance, nestled against a stand of aspen trees. Relief surged through Logan. The supply depot he'd built had a makeshift roof and a few crates of provisions. It wasn't much, but it was a crucial checkpoint on the way to his main camp. He'd never been so grateful to see that rickety shelter. The Mustangs slowed as they approached, ears pricked. Logan slid off the horse's back, collapsing onto his knees. Everything hurt. Black spots danced in his vision, but he managed to keep conscious. The horse circled him, nickering softly, as if uncertain. "I'm all right," Logan lied, though he doubted he was convincing. He crawled the short distance to the shelter, pushing aside the half-rotten door. Inside, he found a small stash of tinned food, some bandages, and a bottle of cheap whiskey he'd left behind for emergencies. This qualified. He tore open the bandages, hands shaking, cursing as pain shot up his side. The Mustang peered in from outside, blowing hot breath that condensed in the chilly air. Logan poured whiskey over his leg wound, biting down on his sleeve to keep from screaming. He then did the same for the various cuts on his arms and face, though with less thoroughness. He was too exhausted to be meticulous, but he tried to at least ward off the worst of infection. After fumbling for a tin opener, he pried open a can of beans and gulped a few spoonfuls. The food tasted like metal, but it was sustenance. He rested for a while, leaning against the shelter's wooden frame, letting the energy from the minimal meal seep into his starving muscles. Outside, the Mustang rustled in the grass, sniffing at the boxes or perhaps searching for more water. Logan closed his eyes, just for a moment, to steady his spinning head. When he opened them again, the sun had shifted noticeably, sliding closer to the western horizon. He groaned, pushing himself upright with a trembling arm. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. His injuries needed proper medical attention, and the horse deserved a real stable, assuming it still wanted anything to do with him once they reached civilization. Gritting his teeth, he gathered what he could: a fresh bandage, the remaining half-bottle of whiskey, and a small coil of rope. Then he emerged from the lean-to, blinking in the bright afternoon light. The Mustang stood a short distance away, grazing near a scraggly bush. Logan approached, moving carefully. The horse raised its head, ears alert, but didn't flee. A sense of kinship, born from shared hardship, lingered between them. Logan exhaled, gingerly mounting again. The ride to the main camp would be shorter now, maybe just a few hours, but it would still push him to his limits. He clung to that hope like a lifeline. They pressed on, following the faint trail through stands of aspens that shimmered in the breeze. The day's warmth dried Logan's clothes and the horse's coat, though it did little to ease the throbbing in his side. He concentrated on each breath, grateful for the bits of shade the trees provided. Occasionally, the Mustang slowed to graze or to sip from puddles left behind by the storm, and Logan let it. Speed wasn't worth pushing the horse beyond reason, especially when it had already given so much. Eventually, the land sloped downward into a broad valley, where Logan knew his base camp was set up near a bend in a river. From the top of a small rise, he could just make out the shape of his truck parked in the distance, alongside the tattered tents he used when scouting for horses. Relief fluttered in his chest, but it was tempered by exhaustion. If he passed out now, at least he was close enough for someone to potentially find him. Maybe. If they hadn't already gone looking for him. The Mustang picked its way down the final slope, each step careful. Logan guided it toward the cluster of tents and outbuildings that comprised his temporary home. As they neared, he spotted movement, figures rushing out, likely having heard the sound of hooves. His Wrangler buddies, or maybe some local ranch hands who had joined him for the expedition, came into view. Their shouts rang out. "Logan! Holy hell, Logan! You're alive!" A wave of relief, so strong it almost undid him, coursed through him. Hands reached up to help him dismount, and he collapsed into welcoming arms. "Easy, boss," one of them said, voice trembling with concern. "We thought you were a goner when you didn't come back last night," another exclaimed. "Where'd you find that horse?" Their eyes flicked to the Mustang, which stood calmly, as if waiting for Logan's command. He tried to speak, to explain everything that had happened, but his voice cracked. Medical kit! He finally croaked, gesturing to his torn clothes and blood-soaked bandages. They laid him on a cot, hastily covering him with a blanket. Someone ran to get the first aid supplies, while another tossed more kindling onto a fire. The Mustang remained a short distance away, pawing at the ground nervously as more people approached. Logan forced himself to lift a hand. "Easy," he rasped, beckoning them to back off. He's been through a lot." Despite their confusion, they gave the horse space. One of his buddies helped him out of his soaked jacket, gasping at the bruising on his ribs. They set to work cleaning and dressing his wounds properly. The pain flared anew, but Logan ground his teeth and let them do what needed to be done. All the while, he kept glancing at the Mustang. Even from a distance, he could feel the horse's eyes on him. Word spread through the camp that Logan had returned with a wild Mustang, and soon more onlookers gathered. Some wanted to rope the horse, to secure it in a makeshift corral. Logan shook his head, forcing out a command between ragged breaths. "No ropes, not yet. Let him be." He mustered a glare to emphasize his point. They backed off, reluctant but respectful. Something in Logan's tone told them this was more than just another horse. After they finished treating his worst wounds, they urged him to stay put, but he insisted on hobbling over to the Mustang. Leaning on a makeshift crutch, he approached the horse slowly, ignoring the chorus of concerned protests behind him. The Mustang stood, ears flicking nervously, but didn't bolt. Logan extended a hand, stroking its neck in front of everyone. The crowd looked on, astonished, as the untamed animal tolerated his touch. One of the wranglers, an older ranch hand named Curtis, removed his hat and approached carefully. "That's a fine horse," he whispered, all evident in his voice. "Might be the best catch of your life, Logan." Logan swallowed, recalling how close he'd come to dying. "He saved my life," he admitted, voice hushed. Curtis's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be." The Mustang snorted, tossing its head as if weary of the attention. Logan grimaced and gestured for the onlookers to disperse. He knew the horse was still wild at heart, and any sudden movement or loud noise could set it off. Carefully, with the help of his crutch, Logan led it to a small enclosure, not a closed corral, but an area fenced on 3 sides, open on the 4th, so the Mustang could leave if it truly wished. The horse walked in, snorting at the unfamiliar surroundings, but didn't immediately run. Logan leaned against the fence, letting out a shuddering breath. One of the medics in camp insisted on rechecking his bandages. Logan was in no position to argue. They patched him up as best they could, advising that he see a proper doctor soon. Logan nodded absently, his gaze still fixed on the Mustang. He owed this creature more than he could say. What amazed him most was that the horse hadn't fled into the open wilderness the moment they'd arrived. It lingered near him, watchful. Perhaps the animal sensed that Logan was still in trouble and might need more help. Dusk rolled in, painting the sky with a fiery gradient. Logan, exhausted beyond measure, wanted nothing more than to collapse in the safety of his tent. But he couldn't tear himself away. Finally, Curtis and another wrangler guided him gently, assuring him that they'd keep an eye on the Mustang. Reluctantly, Logan allowed them to help him hobble to his tent, where he all but fell onto a makeshift cot. Yet sleep wouldn't come easily. Flashes of the storm, the coyotes, the Mustang's furious eyes, all played on repeat behind his closed lids. His body trembled involuntarily, the shock of his ordeal still coursing through him. He must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing he knew, the sky was dark, and a lantern cast flickering shadows on the tent wall. He heard the soft murmur of voices outside and the rustle of the Mustang pacing in the enclosure. His wounds throbbed like a living thing, but he forced himself to get up, craving the cool night air. With the crutch, he made his way outside. The camp was quieter now, most of the crew asleep or resting by the fire. His gaze locked onto the Mustang, which stood at the fence line, gazing back at him. Logan approached, heart pounding with a strange mixture of gratitude and humility. The horse nickered softly, ears swiveling forward. Logan felt a lump in his throat. He reached over the fence, palm up. The horse took a step closer, its dark eyes reflecting the lantern light. Logan spoke quietly. "We made it." The horse sniffed his hand, then stood still, as if expecting nothing more than his presence. Logan rested his forehead on the fence rail, eyes stinging with unshed tears. In that moment, he realized the boundaries between them had shifted. He wasn't just a captor, and this horse wasn't just a prize to be broken. They had saved each other. The Mustang could have bolted a dozen times, leaving him to die in the wilderness, yet it stayed. He could have tried to force the horse into submission during their entire trek, but he didn't. They had formed an unlikely alliance, one built under the most harrowing of circumstances. By morning, word would spread through the ranching community that Logan Carter had captured a stunning black Mustang, one rumored to be unbreakable. Potential buyers might line up, each offering more money than the last to own such a legendary creature. But as he stood there, staring into the Mustang's eyes, Logan felt a twist in his gut. Could he really sell the animal that had saved his life, the one that shared such a profound connection with him? The ranch was on the brink, and the money would help. But at what cost? He stroked the horse's mane, feeling a quiet kinship humming in the space between them. Exhaustion finally claimed him, and he returned to his tent. The night passed in fitful dreams, half-formed visions of the storm, the biting cold, the flash of lightning illuminating a fierce black horse. At one point, he woke in a cold sweat, convinced coyotes were scratching at the canvas. But the camp was peaceful, only the soft chirr of insects in the distance. He drifted back to sleep. When dawn broke, Logan woke to find his injuries bound more tightly by fresh bandages, a sign that someone had been checking on him. Pain still lingered, but it had dulled to a manageable throb. He dressed gingerly, ignoring the protest of his ribs, then made his way outside. The Mustang was still there. A few of the wranglers had tried to offer it hay and water, which it accepted cautiously. It paced the enclosure, occasionally testing the open side that led back to the wild. But it hadn't left. Logan limped over, every step reminding him of his battered body. The horse lifted its head, ears forward, blowing softly. Logan reached out, and the Mustang bridged the gap, pressing its muzzle to his hand. A hush seemed to settle over the camp at that simple gesture. Even the men who lived and breathed horses recognized that something remarkable was happening. Logan sighed, gently stroking the horse's neck. Over the next few days, he tried to balance healing with caring for the Mustang. The two developed a silent understanding. The horse allowed him to approach, to check its flank for scrapes, to brush its coat lightly. It even tolerated a halter after a few more days, though Logan was careful not to push too fast. Word spread that Logan had effectively tamed the wild Mustang, yet he knew in his heart that wasn't quite the right word. He hadn't tamed anything. He had merely earned a measure of trust, one that, if abused, would vanish in an instant. Visitors from nearby ranches came by, marveling at the horse. Offers were made, some with figures high enough to clear Logan's debts and then some. He watched them flash money with a stoic face. But each time, he hesitated. The memory of that night, the Mustang standing over him after he fell, the storm raging around them, fighting off coyotes side by side, played through his mind. This horse was more than a commodity now, it was part of him. Yet the pressure mounted, as people reminded him of the cost of keeping the ranch afloat. Late one evening, while the moon rose high above the camp, Logan stood in the open enclosure with the Mustang. The horse grazed calmly near him, the silver moonlight lending a ghostly sheen to its coat. "I don't know what to do," Logan admitted softly, resting an arm on the fence. The Mustang flicked an ear at the sound of his voice, but continued munching. "Selling you would solve a lot of problems," he went on, feeling the weight of that truth. "But it feels wrong." The Mustang tossed its head, then stepped closer, nudging Logan's shoulder. He let out a quiet laugh, wincing as it jarred his side. "You're not making this easy," he murmured. Then he looked out at the dark horizon, remembering how it felt to be lost in that storm, certain he was going to die. He remembered the terror of the coyotes, the raw pain in his body, and the horse standing firm, refusing to leave him. A lump rose in his throat. After a moment, he made his decision. He wouldn't sell. Instead, he'd figure something else out. Perhaps he'd take on extra work. Maybe he could board some horses for a bigger ranch, or train a few more colts on the side. It would be risky, but letting go of this Mustang, the one that had so fully captured his respect, simply wasn't an option anymore. And if the ranch was meant to survive, it would survive on the bond they had forged. The next day, Logan opened the enclosure gate wide, stepping back to let the horse see it was free to leave. The wranglers looked on, confused. Logan just nodded to them, telling them to trust him. If the Mustang ran off into the hills, so be it. It deserved that freedom. But if it chose to stay, that was its choice. For a long, tense moment, the horse stood at the threshold, tail swishing, eyes scanning the open land. Logan held his breath, ignoring the ache in his leg. Then, slowly, the horse turned back, walked up to Logan, and gently bumped his shoulder. A wave of relief and gratitude washed over him. Days turned into weeks. Logan's wounds healed, though his ribs remained tender, and the coyote bite on his calf left an angry scar. The Mustang grew accustomed to his presence, learning to accept a bridle and eventually even a saddle, though Logan used it sparingly. He knew some might call him foolish for not immediately capitalizing on such a remarkable horse, but he sensed it needed time, just as he had needed time to recover from the terror of that storm. And so it went, man and horse forging a bond that few onlookers truly understood. The memory of that first night under the rocky alcove stayed with them both, a silent testament to what they had endured. As the weeks passed, the ranch's financial troubles remained unresolved, but Logan felt a renewed sense of purpose. There had to be a way forward. He started picking up extra training gigs, renting out a portion of his land. It wasn't easy, but he refused to abandon the Mustang. Each evening, he found a moment to stand with the horse in the open corral, recalling the savage storm, the adrenaline of survival, and the quiet wonder of a wild spirit choosing to stay by his side. To Logan, that was more valuable than any paycheck. And over time, the Mustang became a symbol of hope for everyone around him, a living reminder that even in the harshest conditions, with the odds stacked against you, trust and tenacity can carry you through. The weeks turned into months, and though the ranch's future was still uncertain, Logan noticed subtle improvements. The circle of supporters grew. People came to see the once wild Mustang that roamed freely with a man who refused to break it by force. Kids from neighboring ranches helped out, enthralled by the story of survival. Others, upon hearing rumors of Logan's ordeal, donated small sums or bartered supplies. Bit by bit, the ranch clawed its way back from the brink. One crisp morning, Logan stood in the corral, watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. The Mustang trotted over, and Logan offered a handful of oats. The horse ate contentedly, then nudged his arm. A smile tugged at Logan's lips. He patted the horse's neck and murmured, "We did it, didn't we?" In that moment, he remembered how close he had come to dying out there in the wilderness, and how unlikely it was that he and this horse would share such a bond. Yet here they were, both stronger for what they had faced. He led the Mustang to the open gate, and they walked out together toward the horizon, the ranch house in the distance. Something loosened in Logan's chest, a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He reflected on how his quest to tame the wild Mustang had almost claimed his life, how the horse had ended up saving him instead, and how that single act of unexpected loyalty had changed everything. He turned to the Mustang, running a hand along its mane. The horse flicked an ear back, as if listening. "Sometimes you don't tame the wild," Logan said softly, voice thick with emotion. "You earn its trust." The horse nickered in response, and Logan laughed quietly. He hoped that those who heard their story would understand that real survival wasn't just about brute force or domination. It was about respect, empathy, and perseverance. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the ranch, Logan made his way back toward the house, the Mustang following at his side. His body still bore the marks of their ordeal, but he no longer felt the crushing weight of desperation. He had survived the impossible, formed a bond with a creature most would deem unbreakable, and in doing so, discovered a renewed sense of purpose. He paused just outside the barn, looking back at the rolling hills and the fading memory of that storm-lashed gully. A final wave of gratitude coursed through him for the horse that had stood by him when all hope seemed lost. And as the camera of life panned out on man and Mustang in that golden morning light, Logan felt a surge of gratitude and wonder. He turned to whoever might be watching, whoever might hear his tale, and spoke one last time. If this story gripped you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves stories of survival. We'll see you next time.